In part 1, we learned how Benito Mussolini captured power in Italy and fascism kept growing after the Biennio Rosso years, while the Communist Party, including Gramsci, were still underestimating the threat that fascism posed to the country. Now let us know what unfolded thereafter. Antonio Gramsci had been in Moscow since the summer of 1922 to attend conferences and meetings of the Comintern as a representative of the Italian Communist Party. In Moscow, he met Julia Schucht, a young violinist. They fell in love and got married in 1923. In Italy, while the Communist Party was not banned technically, its leaders, militants, and the press were being constantly persecuted and harassed. The press was ultimately pushed into total silence by the end of 1923 and early 1924. Gramsci's return to Italy was made difficult because of the arrest warrant against him back home. Yet, while still in Moscow as a part of the central group of the Communist Party of Italy, Gramsci outlined 4 key initiatives that the party needed to work on to battle fascism in Italy. Firstly, an intensive propaganda around the slogan of a worker and peasant government. Secondly, a struggle against the hierarchy in labor politics and instead working for an alliance between the workers of the North and the peasants of the South, with special focus on exploring potentialities of organizing armed insurrection in the South. Thirdly, an intensive program of political education within the party to overcome existing internal divisions and enlarging the leadership of the party. And lastly, stepping up of communist activity among those who had to leave Italy and settle elsewhere, especially in France. Gramsci left Moscow in November 1923 to go to Vienna, in Austria, to take charge of a newly founded Comintern Bureau for anti-fascist actions, in hopes of repairing the Communist Party that was still divided over philosophy and strategy. By 1924, Gramsci was still hopeful for a revolution in Italy. He saw fascism as the bourgeois counter-revolution and believed that it was a proof of the inevitability of the revolution. In one of his letters written to his fellow members in the party in February 1924, he lamented the fact that any participation of the masses in the activity and the internal life of the party has been seen as a danger to unity and centralism. As a lifelong proponent of theory of praxis, Gramsci was not satisfied with the prevailing non-participatory and non-activist culture of the left. During his stay in Vienna, he also revived L'Ordine Nuovo in March 1924 to develop these themes in its pages. He wrote the first few issues almost single-handedly. One of the key strategies that he emphasized upon in it was an intensive campaign for political education of the masses. Meanwhile, in the spring of that year, a charade of an electoral exercise was conducted in Italy in a climate of terror and electoral fraud. Most opposition parties were in favor of boycotting the elections, but when the Communist Party decided to participate in them, the other anti-fascist parties followed suit. When the Communist Party in turn proposed an electoral bloc or a coalition, other parties refused it. Thus, the anti-fascist opposition yet again failed to find a common ground and fractured the votes of the working class public. On the other hand, as Hoare and Smith write, fascism had succeeded in absorbing broad strata of the bourgeoisie and petite bourgeoisie behind its electoral list, and by now had won the support of the Vatican. They add that the Fascist Party was backed by the decisive centers of financial and industrial capital. The Communist Party managed to get 19 representatives elected in the parliament, including Gramsci, who had become the leader of the party in April 1924 and returned to Italy the following month. The party was still being managed in accordance with the guidance of the Comintern, that was itself conflicted with various political and philosophical questions regarding revolution and fascism. The ground reality in Italy, however, worsened much too rapidly. On June 10, 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, an Italian socialist and anti-fascist politician, was kidnapped and assassinated by a fascist squad while he was on his way to work to the parliament. Earlier that year, he had written a book titled Un anno di dominazione fascista, or The Fascisti Exposed, a year of fascist domination. Hoare and Smith write that Mussolini's regime seemed on the back foot and internally divided by this high-profile murder of a prominent opposition leader. Its backers appeared to waver. The opposition gained confidence. Gramsci began to gain hope yet again that a social democratic alternative could indeed achieve success, and thus grounds for a proletarian revolution could be prepared. After Matteotti's murder, the opposition parties left the parliament and met in an alternative assembly. Communist Party did participate in this meeting, but its attitude towards other anti-fascist parties had not changed. As the leader of the party, Gramsci felt that the liberal democratic opposition parties were themselves semi-fascist and were not really interested in the revolutionary ideals, but only in maintaining the status quo favoring the bourgeoisie. He thought that fascism was on its decline and the Communist Party should aim to capture the majority of the proletariat instead. Yet again, he and the Communist Party underestimated the dangers and the power of fascism and continued to reject a united front of opposition parties. Their hopes for the collapse of fascism were dashed when the fascists struck back in January 1925, as Mussolini admitted responsibility for Matteotti's murder in a speech, and a new wave of repression was unleashed by the fascists. The opposition continued to believe that this was the last flicker of the flame before it went out. But the fascist regime intensified the dictatorial character of its rule throughout 1925. Eventually, the Communist Party began acknowledging that fascism had, in fact, in the words of Gramsci, given the bourgeoisie a class consciousness and class organization. Gramsci also wrote to his wife Julia, who lived in Moscow, that it was no longer feasible to expect an imminent end to fascism as a regime. He reiterated his stance to fight against fascism through direct action. He spoke of the need to put on the agenda the preparation for an insurrection, the sole means for the masses to express their political will. In subsequent months, prominent leaders of the Communist Party were arrested. The Employers' Federation signed a pact with the fascist corporations, which Hoare and Smith call fake trade unions, granting the latter sole negotiation rights on behalf of the workers. The erstwhile socialist trade unions were decimated. Gramsci advocated for the trade union movement to be resurrected under the control of the Communist Party. The socialist and communist factions still failed to agree with each other. During the autumn of 1925, the arrest of Communist Party members continued. However, the party managed to maintain its membership under extremely difficult conditions. But it did lose a large number of working class members due to the climate of repression. This loss, however, was compensated by the increased recruitment from among the peasantry. In November 1925, the opposition press was completely obliterated, except Avanti, the socialist publication, and Unita, the communist publication. The two publications were allowed a semi-legal existence. The year 1926, that Hoare and Smith describe as a crucial one in the evolution of fascism, saw what little was left of the semi-legal existence of the Communist Party to be increasingly eroded until the month of November, when the fascist regime finally did away with the remnants of opposition which had been allowed to exist till then. The pretext for this final nail in the coffin of the opposition was an alleged attempt made on 31st October 1926 on Mussolini's life by a 15-year-old boy. The Council of Ministers met on 5th November and drafted a series of emergency laws designed to eliminate all semblance of even the liberal democracy that had survived until then in Italy. The Communist Party made plans for Gramsci's escape from Italy to Switzerland, but he was unwilling to leave. He was convinced through the newspaper reports that only the opposition representatives who had been attending the alternative parliament were in danger of losing their parliamentary immunity. He therefore decided to attend the parliament to debate on the new emergency laws proposed to be taken on for quote-unquote discussion on 9th of November. He could not believe that the fascist regime could remove all formal institutions of liberal democracy because, according to him, the ruling classes would never form a consensus on doing so. But the principal reason for his refusal to leave Rome was reported by Camilla Ravera, one of the founding members of the Communist Party, to Togliatti. She said, Antonio observed that such a step should only be taken when the workers could see for themselves that it was absolutely justified and necessary, that leaders ought to remain in Italy until it became quite impossible for them to do so. Gramsci's conviction in unlikeliness of complete demolition of Italian procedural democracy was belied, but his conviction in leadership not abandoning the party followers remained. Gramsci, close to 36 years of age, was arrested in November 1926, disregarding the parliamentary immunity, and taken to the island of Ustica off the north coast of Sicily. Hoare and Smith write that the 6 weeks he spent there in detention were the last in which he enjoyed a relative freedom of movement and extended contact with his comrades, including Bordiga, with whom he had overcome his decades-long political differences. They collaborated in organizing educational courses for the political detainees. Gramsci taught history and geography and studied German himself, while Bordiga took up scientific subjects. On January 27, 1927, Gramsci was transferred to Milan. The prisoners being transported on the 19-day journey there were kept in chains most of the time, as they were shifted from one prison to another across the length of the country. Gramsci was kept in almost permanent isolation for over a year in Milan, with the fascist authorities occasionally also planting in his cell agent provocateurs, or people who intentionally provoke or induce others to commit a crime or an illegal act to incriminate them or discredit their cause. He was not allowed any reading or writing material except for limited number of personal letters. After this harrowing ordeal, he was finally brought to Rome for the political charade that was his trial that started on 28th May 1928. A special tribunal was created for the trial of Gramsci, Terracini and other communist politicians, Mauro Scocchimaro and Giovanni Roveda, along with 19 other defendants. They had been accused of organizing an armed insurrection. As Hoare and Smith point out, the legal proceedings were merely a farce, as the fascist regime had already decided that the defendants needed to be convicted, followed by an exemplary punishment. It was there that the infamous words, "For 20 years we must stop this brain from functioning," were uttered by the public prosecutor, as he pointed out to Gramsci specifically. Sentence came on 4th June with 22 years for Terracini, who had been the main spokesperson for the prisoners, and 20 years each for Gramsci, Scocchimaro, and Roveda. Other defendants were also given harsh sentences. Gramsci was taken to a prison in Turi in the southernmost region of Italy on 19th of July, where he reached in what Hoare and Smith described a state of near collapse from illness and exhaustion after a harrowing journey. Conditions here were slightly better than they were in Milan, solely because he was allowed to write and receive books, albeit not as many as he wished for. Plus, he was also allowed limited contact with his fellow prisoners here. In February 1929, he began writing his thoughts, philosophical musings, theories, and a lot more in a set of notebooks which the world would later come to know and cherish as his prison notebooks. These notebooks went far beyond from becoming a treatise on various political and philosophical topics such as elite theory, political party, state, and revolution, among others, to a body of political thought that is today eponymously regarded as Gramscian political thought. But his already fragile health kept deteriorating. He could have only an irregular communication with his wife Julia, who had given birth to their second child after Gramsci had been incarcerated, a child whom Gramsci could never see. Julia herself spent most of her time in the clinics of Moscow, where she lived, with various nervous illnesses. All this also took a toll on Gramsci's health. When his health permitted him, he read voraciously any books that were not subjected to prison censorship. Critiques and commentaries on thinkers like Marx, whose original works were not allowed in the prison, and magazines and periodicals from where he could get news on latest developments and occurrences in the outside world, were what little he could get to satisfy his limitless intellectual appetite. He used all this to develop his own thought in his notebooks, scribbling away in the limited space of their pages. His letters to his family are described by Hoare and Smith as an extraordinary document of human tenacity that are justifiably reckoned one of the classics of modern Italian literature. They could be seldom complaining and often resigned, but rarely indulged in self-pity. Instead, the letters exhibited an urgent desire to communicate information, ideas, projects, or simply affection. But above everything else, his letters showed his perseverance against the insurmountable odds that he was facing in terms of his deprivation and physical illnesses. Why? Hoare and Smith sum it up perfectly. They write, Gramsci had little to rely on except force of will and the knowledge of belonging, even during this moment of impotence and isolation, to a revolutionary moment. This sense of living for a cause greater than himself inspired Gramsci to obstinately refuse any privileges or special treatments that could be interpreted as favors granted by the regime, and instead he fought for his legal rights as a political prisoner. His refusal for any special treatment aligned with his earlier refusal to escape Italy as the party leader when he had the chance before his imminent incarceration. He developed this idea into a more elaborate thought about the virtue of leadership in his notebooks. He wrote, "The rule has been made that a captain must leave only when everybody else on board is safe. Some have even gone so far as to claim in such cases, the captain must go down with his ship. Without this rule," he adds, "collective life would become impossible, for nobody would be prepared to accept responsibility or continue activity which involved putting their lives in the hands of the others. As his health further worsened, Gramsci became unable to even read or write. Hoare and Smith describe him as having turned hunchbacked and sickly during his incarceration. He suffered at least 3 major breakdowns of his health even while receiving medical attention and maintaining a special diet. They add, his teeth fell out, his digestive system collapsed so that he could not eat solid food. His chronic insomnia became permanent so that he could go weeks without more than an hour or 2 of sleep at night. He had convulsions when he vomited blood and suffered from headaches so violent that he beat his head against the walls of his cell. Gramsci's hellish ordeal was somewhat mitigated more than 5 years later when, as a result of an international campaign demanding for his release by the anti-fascist circles, concerned for his pathetic condition, he was finally transferred at the end of 1933 from Thury to a clinic in Formia based on urgent medical necessity. Despite being in such a state and even in contravention against the fascist penal code, he was still held as a prisoner at the clinic, where his room was specially converted into a prison cell and he was constantly harassed by brutal supervision. But with what little medical attention he was afforded, he regained some semblance of health at the clinic. And as soon as he did, he resumed his work in his notebooks. Gramsci had refused to let die the one thing that the fascist regime wanted to stop working, and that was his brain. Right when he was first arrested, he had written to his sister-in-law Tatiana, "I am obsessed by the idea that I ought to do something for eternity." He continued, "I want, following a fixed plan, to devote myself intensively and systematically to some subject that will absorb me and give a focus to my inner life." Gramsci understood what the fascists intended to do when they subjected him to this incarceration. He once wrote, "Prison is so finely wrought a file that it destroys thought utterly." And so he refused to let his thoughts to be destroyed and summoned every single ounce of health and energy that he could to engage in thought and document it. But his health had already been damaged beyond repair. Another round of international pressure allowed him to be granted provisional liberty in accordance with his constitutional rights, but only in name. The most that he was afforded was removal of bars from his window and permission to go for walks. In August 1935, suffering from arteriosclerosis as well as a tubercular infection of the back known as Pott's disease, and from pulmonary tuberculosis along with high blood pressure, angina, gout, and acute gastric disorders, he was finally moved into a proper clinic in Rome. He was due to be released after 11 years of imprisonment, counting remission of penalty, on April 21, 1937. His hope was that if his health permitted, he would return to Sardinia to recover and recuperate. But when the day of his release came, he was too ill to even be moved from the clinic. 6 days later, he died. His sister-in-law Tatiana smuggled away 32 of his notebooks from his room while making arrangements for his funeral, and managed to send them to Moscow via a diplomatic bag. Gramsci called his notebooks the focus to my inner life, but for the world and for history, they were a symbol of the ultimate victory of a brain of a revolutionary that posed the ultimate threat to fascism. This account depicts the story of Gramsci and Mussolini, who both started with socialist politics, were both ardent followers of the theory of praxis that prioritized action on the ground, but both diverged onto two separate paths to diametrically opposite political positions. Mussolini made a hard turn to the right and founded the movement of Fascism, whereas Gramsci gravitated further towards the left and founded the Communist Party of Italy. The key difference was that Mussolini was motivated by ideological depravity and political opportunism, while Gramsci was compelled by his conviction and fidelity to his beliefs and ideals. Their belief in political action on the ground, however, remained intact. Mussolini interpreted it in the most harmful and destructive way possible, through mobilization of paramilitary squads that used violence for crushing any kind of dissent or assertion of rights by the working classes and the peasantry. Gramsci, on the other hand, continuously appealed for better organizing the proletariat, who were already engaged in a monumental struggle against the big industrialists and landed elites. But the socialist and the communist factions let him down throughout his political career. Had his calls been heard by the socialist and the communist parties, perhaps the resistance to fascist movement could have been strong enough to not let it grow as powerful as it did. As fascism kept growing, both Gramsci and his party failed to adequately assess its threat. He only belatedly acknowledged the danger and power of fascism and advocated for organizing a ground-level anti-fascist insurrection. But his insistence on not building a united parliamentary front with other anti-fascist opposition parties also aided fascists in capturing power in the parliament and establishing a totalitarian rule. But one should be cautious in drawing a conclusion from this summation that the fascists were better at organizing themselves on the ground than the left and other anti-fascist opposition forces. As one can see from this account, the sole aim of fascism was to garner as much power as it could. They mobilized their foot soldiers by appealing to their most basal human instincts of hatred and violence, which required no real intellectual effort and targeted not the powerful elites but the masses fighting against their exploitation. Naturally, the big capitalists and the landed elites supported the fascists both financially and politically, making them all the more formidable a force. The real intellectual and physical struggle was to stand in solidarity with the exploited masses who were fighting against all odds to secure a better world for themselves and help better organize their efforts. That is what Gramsci tried to do relentlessly and paid a heavy price for it. Even when he was confined within the four walls of the prison, battling isolation, unjust incarceration, and his perennial bad health, he was still investing all his intellectual faculties to evolve both a philosophical and a strategic treatise aimed at building and strengthening a movement to achieve a revolution for the masses in what the world today knows as his prison notebooks. That is what fascism, with all its ill-gotten might and power, can never defeat: the spirit and thought of dissent and resistance. If you want to know more about Gramsci's philosophy both before his incarceration and as expressed in his prison notebooks, drop in a comment on this video. To know more about the source of information for this video, kindly check the description below. If you liked this video, please like and share it. Share your feedback through the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. To get notified about our latest videos, please press the bell icon below. Thank you for watching.